Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to continue our discussion about change and transformation in Asia in response to European encroachment and imperialism by diving into the history of Japan and talking about the Meiji Restoration. So here's our main objectives for today. We'll take a moment and take them in. And then we'll talk about how these various forces led Japan to react to Western imperialism in some similar ways to China, but also some really important differences in their reaction, and how that's going to lead to a very different outcome for the Japanese. So, as you hopefully remember from last semester, when we last left the Japanese, the Tokugawa shogunate had issued the Closed Country Edict, banning all Japanese travel abroad and really limiting the ability of foreigners to come into Japan. Of course, as we talked about last semester, the closed country edict was never as complete as it looks on paper. There were always Japanese people going abroad. There were always some foreigners allowed in, specifically the Dutch and Chinese. But the thing that the Tokugawa shogunate did is really elevated the samurai class into rulership and centralized governmental power by cutting down on the power of regional daimyo, these sort of outsider daimyo, and increasing the power of the daimyo who were loyal to the Tokugawa shogun through the whole Sankin Kotai system that we talked about, the alternate attendants, and really transforming Japanese society and Japanese social classes, moving the samurai from these type of hereditary warriors to bureaucrats. Because hereditary warriors, these sort of feudal warriors that we view the samurai as, weren't super useful in a period of 200 years of mostly peace. And so you really don't need the same type of martial skills. I mean, this was baked into samurai culture, so samurai still had to do this and train in this. But when you're not actually fighting anyone, the samurai instead become a class of hereditary bureaucrats and government servants, carrying out the sort of goals of the Tokugawa. And then of course all of this is controlled by the Tokugawa and by the Tokugawa family, their military retainers, and the whole, their secret police system, the Metsuke, and what we see is centralized power in Japan. The problem that the Japanese had is 200 years of mostly isolation has led to some cultural and economic and political stagnation in Japan, as well as technological stagnation. And so the Japanese were clearly aware of this. You saw many forward thinking Japanese looking at what was happening to China because the Japanese were very aware of the Opium Wars in China and what had happened there. And we're starting to see that, man, we are falling far behind. And if Europeans showed up, we're probably not going to be able to defeat these barbarians the way that we're sort of traditionally used to. I mean, Japan had had a number of time periods where they've been invaded by foreign powers, most famously in the Yuan dynasty. And what the modern Japanese are saying is that our traditional ways of fighting are no longer going to be adequate. And this was really highlighted with the Perry expedition. The United States sent out a flotilla of ships, of these sort of modern gunships, under the command of Matthew Perry here, with the goal being to open up Japan to Western trade. When they got into Yokohama Harbor, Perry inspected their defenses and presented the Japanese with a white flag saying, "You're going to need this." He then demonstrated the firepower of American ships, and the Japanese realized that they really had no ability to fight back against this modern technology. These warships that can obliterate cities from out in the harbor, the Japanese have no particular answer for this, and so they signed the Treaty of Kanegawa with the Americans, allowing the United States to open up a series of treaty ports in Japan and allowing other countries inside. And we started to see this. We started to see two different forces developing within Japanese society. There was an element of Japanese society that started idealizing Americans and Westerners, studying Western culture and trying to learn the lessons of Westerners. And then there was also an element of Japanese society that pushed back against this and attempted to expel Western forces and double down on traditional Japanese tactics, culture, things like that. And so, just the same way you saw in China, modernizers versus sort of traditionalists, you saw this in Japan as well. And for the Shishi, the group of samurai who were pushing back against all of this westernization, the rally cry became, revere the emperor and expel the barbarians. And so you saw them attacking foreigners when they showed, in the cities in which they were settling, and putting pressure on Japanese people to not cooperate with all of these Western barbarians. At the same time, we saw a push to modernize Japan. The whole Sankin Kotai system was a massive economic drain on Japan. You were starting to see new businesses show up, and Japanese people adopting Western ways and trying to convince the samurai that they needed to sort of modernize and change if they were going to take their place in the modern world. The shogunate took a lot of these samurai and made them into sort of a secret police force named the Shinsengumi, significantly increasing the power of their secret police, the Metsuke, in order to sort of counter some of these rising forces. And we saw a significant conflict between Japanese, especially within the shogunate, who wanted to modernize, versus Japanese who saw this as a threat. My favorite is the meeting between Sakamoto Ryoma and Katsu Kaishu. So take a moment to read and move forward here. And so this movement to expel the barbarians was eventually adopted by the Japanese Emperor Kome. And so he issued a order to a variety of different to the Japanese daimyo to expel the barbarians and retake control over Japanese society, to avenge the Japanese defeat and the signing of the Treaty of Kanegawa. And so the Japanese Choshu clan attempted to close the straits of Satsuma between the islands of Honshu and the island of Kyushu down south here, attempted to close this to any Western travel. They started firing on any Western ships that came through, and what they learned is our technology is not sufficient to do this. There would have been some attempts to bring in modern weapons, but a flotilla of British gunships came in and just literally destroyed the city. Destroyed the batteries, set fire to the city, burned it to the ground, and this whole movement showed the Japanese that resistance to these foreign forces is utterly pointless, and if we're actually going to modernize and push back, we need to adopt Western ways and become much more modern. And so the Choshu clan invited in the British, who they had just been defeated in this war, and attempted to bring in new technology. And what we started to see is an alliance of these Japanese clans who are modernizing in order to push back against the powerful shogun clans. And so specifically, the Satsuma and Choshu clans, in addition with two other Japanese clans, joined together in order to push back against the shogun in the name of the Japanese emperor. And so to some degree, it's about restoring the emperor to power, but it's really more about changing the Japanese families who are in control of Japanese government. And specifically, these clans tried to join together with the British and the French to bring in modern technology and to overthrow the shogunate. This Wood Dragon, or Boshin War, sort of pitted traditional samurai against the modern emperor, but that's really too simplistic of a story because the shogunate was modernizing as well. And so it's really a battle between the Tokugawa and their aligned families and the Choshu and Satsuma and their aligned families for control over Japanese society. Really elevating the emperor was somewhat secondary, and it was much more a political struggle between these two groups that was won by Choshu and Satsuma. And so what we saw is their modernization and their use of British and French advisors and technology was better than the shogunate troops, and they were able to defeat the forces of the shogunate and overthrow the last shogun. Here we see the overthrow of the shogun. We see the killing of Japanese officials who sided with the shogunate, and we see the overthrow of samurai rule in Japan. This led to the new emperor, the Emperor Meiji, coming to power as mostly he had some significant power, but he's also, kind of a figurehead. Japanese political power is always sort of tricky. Remembering all the way back to the sort of previous eras of Japanese history, the emperor is the head of state, but power often lays with regents, with other families, with other groups. And so during the Meiji Restoration, the slogan was enrich the nation and strengthen the armies, bring in Western sort of Western technology, Western styles, Western military tactics, things like that. You start to see the Japanese adopting Western dress. You see especially military dress for the imperial family here. And here's the Charter Oath of the Meiji Restoration. We get a constitution, sort of similar to the way that the British have, laying out sort of principles here. We see some measures of equality and civil rights, like you would see, in other European societies. We see missions sending Japanese around the world to attempt to learn from and modify their society based on what Westerners were doing. Most famously, the Iwakura mission traveled around the world to both places in Europe, places in Asia, and across the United States, famously meeting with the Ulysses Grant administration in order to, take a moment and read, bring in these new ideas, figure out what people in the world do what things best, and then model their society after them. So, for example, they're going to take parts of the American education system and modify it and bring it to Japan. They're going to take the British naval system and build a modern navy, similarly to how the British Navy is organized. They're going to bring in the Germans, who have the strongest sort of land force and army, and bring in their technology and tactics to train the Japanese army, and basically try to completely transform Japanese society to model it after the way the most successful people in the world are running their society. The Japanese government is also sort of like the British government. You've got an elected representative, the Imperial Diet, with a upper and a lower house voted on by the population. You've got a military draft from the people, to fill up the armed forces. You've got ministers of state that are appointed by the emperor, sort of like the cabinet system. You've got an independent court system. You've got former senior statesmen advising the emperor. And the emperor is theoretically all powerful. If there's a problem with the Japanese system, it's that there's not a lot of connection between these various groups who except through the emperor. And so when you have a responsible, vigorous emperor like the Meiji emperor, then you don't necessarily have problems here because he can coordinate between these various groups and everything works fine. The problem is if you don't have a vigorous emperor here, a lot of these sort of areas operate independently, and specifically the independence of the armed forces and the fact that the armed forces are not under the control of the civilian sort of government is going to be a problem going forward. We're going to see massive economic expansion in Japan as they start bringing in the factory system and then the Second Industrial Revolution to modernize and transform Japanese society. This has clear effects similar to the effects that industrialization had on Europe. So take a moment, pause, read My Two Parents. And we see the rise of powerful sort of industrial families known as zaibatsu. This is going to break down the traditional social structure because merchants and bankers were traditionally at the bottom of any sort of Confucian hierarchy. But now all of a sudden, you've got these spectacularly wealthy Japanese industrialists who have a lot of money and a lot of influence. And so to some degree, you're going to see Confucian society and the social structure broken down. You're going to see revolts of samurai groups pushing back against their loss of status, although they're mostly going to be crushed by the modern Japanese army, and Japan is going to substantially modernize. In order to finally solidify their status as a new powerful country, the Japanese are going to look to the English as their natural allies. They're going to unify together in what's called the Anglo-Japanese Alliance, setting up a treaty of friendship, some sort of cultural, economic, and military exchanges between the two powers, and they're going to sign a treaty that says that if one of the two powers goes to war against more than one country, the other country will jump in, which is going to become really important once we get to World War II, but is also going to be important for the various regional conflicts we're going to be talking about, because if Japan declares war on just one other country, they can fight it alone. But if anyone comes to the aid of the country the Japanese are fighting, they've got John Bull and the British here to provide them with backup. So it's a security system, and it's a way for the Japanese to be elevated into the sort of the echelon of great nations like the British. So we see a mass. So take a moment, pause, and read 50 Years of New Japan. It's pretty straightforward. Obviously, Japanese society has been completely transformed through the Meiji Restoration. They've completed the process of industrialization spectacularly rapidly with all of its advantages and problems. And now they're going to start looking and going around for more resources. And so that's what we're going to talk about tomorrow, is when the Meiji government and Japanese society in general starts to expand in order to get more resources to fill their sort of growing industrial political machine. So that's for next time. Thank you for listening.